Well, hello there and welcome back to the Mission Boards channel. Today I'm going to be working on a jig to fix a problem that I have. And the problem comes in when we make these. This is our metal pizza peel. And it has to have this slot cut in it so that it accepts the metal blade, the aluminum blade. And so when we make these handles, then we have to cut that slot. I'm hoping that you can see that. But the problem is cutting that slot accurately has proven to be very difficult, and I've tried a lot of different ways to do it. Mostly we've been trying to cut this on the bandsaw, and the problem with that is that the bandsaw blade makes a thinner curve than this metal blade accepts. So I have to cut it once and then move the fence on the bandsaw ever so slightly and try to cut it again. And inevitably what happens is I end up with a kerf that's too big, and it fits, but it's kind of sloppy, and I really don't like that. So I'm going to try and come up with a system that I can cut the perfect slot through this and do it over and over again and do it predictably and do it safely. And so I'm going to make a jig that will hold this blank so we can cut it safely. And that's going to be the whole emphasis today, is to make this jig. And if you don't know what a jig is just a device or a fixture that you use to make a repeated cut or to do some kind of a procedure that you want to do over and over again. So it allows you to do repetition of things and do it accurately and do it safely. So there's a lot of jigs used in woodworking. And today we're going to make a jig to cut this groove. So the first thing I've done in making this jig is to just glue up 3 pieces of melamine coated particle board. So I just ripped them to this size. I glued the 3 of them together, and I reinforced that glue joint with some screws. And this is going to become the table that I use. I needed it to be so thick because ultimately I'm going to put a saw curve through it that comes down here 1.25 inches, so that's over halfway through. So, or about halfway through, not quite halfway through. So I need it to be solid and to be able to support repeated use. And then the next thing I'm going to do is cut this notch in it. And this is going to be a little difficult to cut, but I'm going to try to cut this notch out of the whole stack at one time so it's all consistent. And the notch is basically 5 inches across. And the 5 inches is important because that's the width of the blanks that we use to make the handles for the metal pizza peels. So I'm going to cut this notch first. I'm going to try to cut it in both directions on the bandsaw, and then figure out how to cut back through and get this whole notch taken out. All right, so I've got my safety glasses on. I've got my hearing protection on. I've got the dust collector turned on. So let's see if we can cut a notch out of this thing. All right, so it took a little finesse. It's a big hunk of particle board to cut, but I think we got a notch and I think it's big enough. And that should work well. So we'll move on to the next step, which is going to be attaching the back plate to this and then ultimately putting some supports under it to hold it in place. And then I'm going to build a clamp system that will allow us to hold the piece that we're going to cut in place. So I'll show you all that as I work through it here. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is attach the base to the back, and that's a little bit tricky to do because I only want to screw it in from the back. So I'm going to use my sliding scale here to set this at 1 inch in. Hopefully keep that pretty consistent. And then I'm going to clamp it down because ultimately I'm going to have to turn this thing over. I have to turn it over a little bit to screw it in from the back. So we get the clamps on it. Hopefully they will hold it. Sure we got this correct. Clamps are great, but it's very easy for something like this to slide around a little bit. And that becomes the difficulty. When I flip it over here, it may want to move. One more check. And I have to be careful where I put the screws to hold this, because ultimately there's going to be a saw kerf that comes down through this. So I want to make sure I keep the fasteners low enough. I think I'll just try to put them at 3 inches down for now. And we'll add some more in a little bit. So I'm just going to pre-drill some holes. I love working with melamine because the consistency of it's pretty impressive. The thickness always stays the same. It's easy to cut. It's easy to drill. And I just don't have some of the problems where things want to move, screws want to move as you drive them into grained wood. You know, that grain wants to move the direction of the screw around. It's just not a problem you have when you're working with particle board, or in this case, melamine coated particle board. All right, so we got one screw in it. We'll double check this. Still looks good. We'll try to get the second screw in it. So I'm just using regular drywall screws. I could use something else, but the drywall screws bite really good. They're coarse thread screws. They countersink themselves well, and I really do like using them in a situation like this. All right, so that should hold it together. I'm going to take the clamps off and add some additional screws out on the end here. Try to do this so you can see better, but so you saw me maybe change the angle, but that screw actually hit one of the screws that I used to hold the stack of 3 pieces together for the top. So just change the angle a little bit to get around it. And then I need to add some additional screws up higher. So all the screws right now go into the center of this bottom piece. And again, there's going to be a saw kerf that comes down through here. So I don't have a whole lot of room. I'm going to have to put some pretty shallow screws up a little bit higher in the top piece. So I'm going to do that next. And I'll probably just use 1.25 inch drywall screws as soon as I find them. All right, so this is what it looks like so far. This is going to be the top. It's going to get mounted on the side of one of the router tables. And then it looks like that if you look up at it from the bottom. And ultimately what will happen is these blanks will get put up in there flush with the top. And then I'm going to create a clamping device here that holds it in place and keeps it perpendicular. And then we'll run a saw across the top of it. And I think this is going to be the best and safest way to do this. So I'm going to make some more parts and pieces. I'll show you when I put those together. All right, so I've made a few more pieces that we're going to put on the jig. And the first thing I did was to plane down this piece. And I used a separate piece here just so I can adjust the thickness, because ultimately this piece is going to get fastened in place and then these blanks are going to slide up through there. But I don't want much wiggle room between the opening and the blank. So we're going to go ahead and fasten this down. And I just want to make sure that I get it good and square. That's going to be really important. And I got to make sure I get it flush on top, which I know you can't see. And I'm just going to put a couple of brads in it just to hold it in place. So I can put some screws in it from the back. And actually, these aren't brads, they're headless pins. And my battery's dead. So I put 6 pins in it. That should hold it. It's all nice and square. It's flush on the top side. And then the next step is going to be to also attach these guide blocks. They're going to hold it in place, keep it from moving left to right. All right, that's on there good. So the last thing is to just screw this piece of maple I put on there, screw it on. And I have to have just the right screw to do that. All right, so here's what we have so far. It's actually going to go up like this. And then, as you can see, the handle blank is going to get pushed up through there like that until it's flush. And then we're going to run a saw across this. And the saw should always right up against the back as the fence, and put a very predictable cut through there. That's the right width and in the right spot. That's the hope. So the next thing I got to do is to build a clamping device on here to hold this. So when we push it up through, ultimately we want to be able to clamp it down so it doesn't move. And we'll work on that clamping device here next. All right, hopefully you can see this well, but I've continued to make some parts. So I made this, which is ultimately going to be the part that gets clamped on here. And I took a Forstner bit and I recessed the hole a little bit just because I think I'll need that extra eighth to be able to tighten down the knobs. And then what I'm going to do is bring this over. Already started it, but I just set it on there. I use this as a spacer board, and I just held it there and drilled a couple of holes just so I know what straight down looks like. And now I'm going to have to bore these out at a bigger diameter, because ultimately what I'm going to do is run these carriage bolts through the back, and then I'm going to put a nut and a washer on this side, and then this board's going to go on the carriage bolts too, and it's going to then get clamped. Use these knobs to actually clamp it down and hold the board in place. So those are going to be the next steps, and I'll probably work on that tomorrow. So I'll be back here in the morning. All right, well, it's the next morning and I'm back at the wood shop, and I'm going to keep working on the jig that we're constructing. And first thing I'm going to do is bore a hole, a bigger hole through all this, because the bolt that I'm going to use is a 5/16 bolt. So we're going to go just slightly over that. 5/16 would be 10/32, so we're going to go at 11/32 and bore this hole through here and the whole way through the bottom. And so that's what I'm going to do next. Scrap a 2x4 so don't ruin the good stuff. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the jig. Let's just bore these holes straight through. So I had to run and find some washers. We're going to go ahead and install carriage bolts. Just snug it up by hand, and then I'm taking the hammer and I'm going to drive this carriage bolt in. It has a square recess to it. Helps hold it in place. Enables you to tighten it without a wrench on this side. Okay. So I got them both on there hand tight, and at this point I'm just going to use a wrench and tighten them up a little bit. It would be easy to over tighten them, and I don't want to do that, but I want them very snug, and I want to make sure they're not going to come loose again. So I think that'll do it. Pretty stout. Then this is the part that we made at the end of yesterday, and it's actually going to get cinched on here and tightened down by these knobs. So that ultimately we can put this board up underneath. Can secure it in the right spot here at the top and tighten this down. And it's going to hold that piece very tightly in place while I saw through the top of it. So it looks pretty good. I wish my carriage bolts were just a hair longer. They were like 3 1/4 instead of 3 inches, it would be perfect, but I think I'm going to bore the holes in this out just a little bit more. I'm going to find one bigger size drill bit, bore them out, just so that they move a little easier on there. All right, so we're back, and what I've made is just some angle pieces that look like this, and they're just going to become supports that you're going to get screwed on out on the edges here. I've angled them a little bit so that they're softer if you bump your hand or your arm into them. And just going to go ahead now and attach them onto the jig. Okay, so I went and found my pocket hole jig, and this is basically just a Craig pocket hole jig. I've had this thing for probably 25 years. I know they make better ones. I probably should buy one, but I don't use it that often. But it is a handy thing for certain applications, like attaching the top of this to our jig. So this just clamps on there, and then you use their special bit. It's a stepped bit, and you use their special bit to bore the hole. All right, so 4 pocket holes. Now I'm going to go ahead and attach this. Try to clamp it down, which won't be easy to do because of the angle. I'm going to try to cinch the top up first before I screw down along the side. good grip. So we got the pocket screws in, so these are cinched up to the top. The only thing really left to do is to attach the sides to the back. Try to get this at an angle where maybe you can see me do that. So that should give me 1/2 inch of penetration into the oak, which is quite strong. I think that will hold it sufficiently. So we'll start at the top here. All right, so there you have it. The only thing that really is left to do is to attach this to the side of the bench. And once I do that, we'll be able to cut the initial slot down through it. And I'll show you all that. But this is where we've made it to so far. We've got our movable holder so we can slide these pieces in and out. And then when we get them flush with the top, we can tighten them down so they don't move. Just like that. And you can see that piece is lodged in there. And then we're going to run a saw curve across it, 1.25 inches deep. But the next step will be to mount this on the bench. All right, so I'm about ready to make this cut, but I decided to make one little change first, and that is to add one more piece of oak here that's going to serve as a rail so that the saw always runs in there and it can't move around at all. And I think that would have some benefit in the future. So I've cut this piece and I'm ready to just screw it down. And if I don't drop the screws, it shouldn't take long. All right, I think we got it. So the last thing I need to do is just, because I'm going to try to keep this one saw over here and just use this saw all the time for this. If somebody does pick it up and move it, I'll just have to reset the depth. But I need this to cut at 1.25 inches. I'll probably make this initial cut just a hair deeper than that. So we're about 1 5/16 inches. And just going to go ahead and saw through this. So yeah, all that work making a jig just to do that one cut. But I'll show you why it matters here. Because of the jig, I was able to make a really straight cut. It's a very narrow cut. It doesn't wander, it stays in place. And it's exactly where I want it to be. I want the bottom side of this to be just a hair thicker than the top side. And it's a nice square cut. It looks good. Let me just make sure that the metal fits in there properly. And we'll call this a win here shortly. All right, so here's that blank that we made on the new jig. Here's one of our small metal pizza pills that we bent, and it's ready to go. And hopefully this fits right in there. I'll look like a fool here if it doesn't, but I need it to be snug, but not too snug. And I think that looks great. The only problem I see is that I need to cut it just a hair deeper. So maybe another 1/16 in depth. So anyways, that fits great. That's what we're trying to achieve. And I'm really excited about using this jig over and over to make our our pizza peel cuts. And that ultimately is going to give us a lot better pizza peel. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please like and subscribe. And we'll keep making videos and show you the things that we do in the wood shop. And I appreciate you watching Mission Board's channel. Have a great day.